So I've recently finished reading Tim Keller's The Meaning of Marriage. He actually wrote this book in collaboration with his wife, who is Kathy Keller. And Kathy actually writes one of the chapters in this book, I believe it's chapter 5 or chapter 6. And that chapter is quite an interesting one, deals with some questions that I think a lot of us ask. So I want to start off by saying that this is another strong recommend. I know after my video on Tim Keller's Forgive, I said that these books don't come around often, and it seems like Tim Keller must just be that kind of author, because for me at least, this has all of the strongest recommendations that no matter who you are, I recommend you read this book. I'll give you 3 dichotomies that I think should still read this book. So whether you're single or you're married, I think you should read this book. For those who are single, especially at the start, it goes through a lot of hesitancy that people who are single have. Tim Keller is actually the pastor of a church he started becoming the pastor of a church that had a surprisingly high number of single people in a way that hadn't been seen in other places or that he hadn't seen in other places. And so he found himself writing about marriage even when his church had predominantly single people in it. And there's a really good discussion in that chapter 1 about people who are looking for, say, compatibility in marriage and what they really understand compatibility to mean. And this is where Tim Keller does a good job of looking at other research, what other people have done and the studies that they've done to see what people mean when they say, I just want a compatible partner. So if you're single, I think this is a really good book for you as well. It also helps set expectations from what marriage is like. People often say that marriage is a lot of work, and I think that's definitely true. I'm not married myself, but that's something I understand to be. And I think a lot of that comes across in the book as well. But what also comes across in the book is I think that it is worth it. That's if you're single. If you're married, I think this is really invaluable advice. I think there's things that naturally we do when we talk to people that we love, whether they are spouses or family, pointing out flaws in them or something, even if it's genuinely because we want to improve their character, that maybe can hurt them as part of that process. And the book does a really good job of dealing with how should you approach a spouse and what should a spouse's role be? Why is it that a spouse can sometimes hurt you so much more than anybody else, but that their affirmation can sort of affirm you so much more than everybody else as well? So if you're married, I highly recommend you read this book. Not really sure if you should read it together or if you should read it separately, each on your own. I'm not married myself. If you find that reading books together is a helpful thing, then this is a good one to do it like that. My only hesitation in that regard is I don't want you reading this book and thinking of the wrong or how the other person in the relationship might benefit. I feel like it's just all too tempting when you read a passage and you're like, hey, see, he told you, don't do that thing that you did last week or whatever. I don't want you to use it like that, and I don't think the book should be used like that. I think the book is at its best when you are taking the ideas, reflecting on it, reflecting on the Bible and what it says about marriage, and considering that on your own behavior and thinking more about what you can do. And part of that involves open conversations with your significant other. But I don't think it's a good idea to read the book and use it to point out additional flaws or to tell your spouse, hey, you shouldn't do this because Tim and Kathy said so. I think it's better if you're both able to independently get convicted and come to those conclusions through reading. So whether that'll happen with you when you read together or when you read separate, I'll leave that up to you. So that's first dichotomy, whether you're single or you're married. The second one I'll give, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian. Maybe I should have started with this. Now, undoubtedly, Tim is a pastor. This comes from a biblical perspective. He's looking at what the Bible says about it. And how we can use that and how we as Christians should grow using that. But he also acknowledges the general world's perspective on marriage. And especially in that first chapter when he's finding things people say about marriage, he talks about divorce in the first chapter and some statistics and some findings about people who stay together after wanting to get divorced but don't, versus people who actually do get divorced and stay separate, and what are their happiness like in those circumstances. So he does definitely consider a non-Christian perspective as part of this and sort of ask the question of what is the best way to approach this, right? There is a perspective we can get to by thinking of marriage as a thing that I do in order to fill my needs. And then that's something that will naturally end when that marriage stops filling your needs. And so that might be a worldly perspective that he will discuss, he will look into, and he'll compare that to what he believes the Bible presents about the meaning of marriage, as the title suggests, and hopefully show you that different perspective. So not saying that this is intentionally going to be a completely unbiased read. Like I said, he believes in the Bible. But I think Tim Keller is really fair with the examination of the reality of our culture and in showing this perspective to you. So that's if you're not Christian. If you are Christian, I think there's stuff in here that you can sort of help non-Christian friends with, like we said at the start. But also, I think for you and your spouse who are genuinely trying to sort of live God's way, I think this is a really good guide that has lots of Bible verses and backing for everything that is said about how you should live together one with another. And the last dichotomy I want to give is, I think this works if you're male or female, and I guess if the gender is neither of those things because it's something you identify with. That might be a little bit harder. Tim takes a sort of traditional view on marriage, which is between, one man and one woman, and that's sort of the biblical perspective. And so that will undeniably be like the focus of the book. But if you are in that position, if you are identifying as either a man or a woman, I think this is definitely a book for you. So he talks a lot about his own relationship and his own perspective, and he doesn't do the sort of men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing and like assume that all men are like this or all women are like this. But you can see how two people from different genders can completely misunderstand each other in certain ways, and through communication and learning about one another and talking and developing that relationship, get better at sort of dealing with one another and working well together in that way. So he talks about that. Kathy in particular, so she has an entire chapter, I'll check if it's chapter 5 or chapter 6. It is chapter 6 called Embracing the Other. And that chapter is entirely dedicated to gender roles. So Tim and Kathy, point to the Bible, and the Bible does talk about things that men should do, things that women should do. It's often said, or it's often read in, say, Ephesians, that men are asked to love and women are asked to submit. And then there's this question, is that an identical action? Are those different things? Does that mean like men are greater than women? All this kind of question. And that's something that Kathy deals with in that chapter, sort of from her perspective. And it's a really interesting perspective. I highly recommend a read of that chapter for anyone, even if you're not going to read the full book. Because Tim and Kathy actually met in a missionary school, or like a seminary, like training to be Bible teachers at Bible college. But Kathy actually ends up dropping out, I think after she meets Tim and, I can't remember after they get married or after they're in a relationship, partly realizing or seeing that she couldn't see herself in that position as like a pastor of a church, and reconcile that with what she thought the Bible's roles of gender roles were. And it goes a little bit through her discussion. What does that look like? Is it about ability? Is it not about ability? This kind of thing. So it's a genuine investigation of it and trying to understand and live the Bible's way. And I think it's clear from the book that, marriage, there's lots of things in it that are hard. It's not like an easy thing. It takes intentional work, and I think that's something that's really emphasized throughout the book as well. But that ultimately it is done for a purpose. And I think that purpose, that meaning, is an important part of the book. And that's sort of what Tim and Kathy start with throughout their book as well. So highly recommend The Meaning of Marriage to anyone, like I said. As soon as you're of an age where even the concept of, singleness or being in a relationship is something you might consider, so whatever age that might be for you, then I think it's worth taking a look at this. Some chapters may be slightly more relevant when you actually get married a little bit later. Certainly for me, I think if that time comes, I will want to revisit the book and I want to sort of reread it again. But I do think it is beneficial for you in any stage of life at the moment. So that's the book again, The Meaning of Marriage by Tim and Kathy Keller. Highly recommend.